Welcome to True Drew Podcast, your source for all things Nancy Drew. I'm your host, Avery, and on this podcast, we'll discuss everything from the Nancy Drew books, to computer games, to movie adaptations, and TV shows. Nothing is off the table. So if you're a True Drew, you'll definitely want to tune in for this podcast. Content warning. The episode you're about to listen to covers a Nancy Drew original text story. These books were written from the 1930s to 1950s, a time that was culturally very different. Within some of these original stories, there are sometimes references to alcohol, smoking, and racist depictions. Listening discretion is advised. Hello guys, and welcome to another episode of True Drew Podcast. I had to look and see what day it is because I often do these episodes like way in advance because there's a lot of books to read, a lot of stuff to do, a lot of life to live, but it's 2025, so Happy New Year. And I'm not gonna lie, 2024 was it was a struggle year for me. I don't know how it was for you. Hopefully you had a good year. I had some good moments, I will say that, but there were some hard things that I had to deal with this year. But yeah, we're not going to talk about that today. We're going to talk about another original text Nancy Drew story, the third book in the series, The Bungalow Mystery. So when it came to my rating for the revised text of The Bungalow Mystery, I didn't really like it very much. If you listen to that episode, you probably already know how I rated it. And if you don't, then, you could always stop this and go listen to that and then come right back. I won't tell you how to live your life. But at the end of this episode, we'll compare to see, which one I rated higher, the revised text or the original. But spoiler alert, I am going to say I liked the original text for this book a little bit more than the revised, which so far that seems to be the case with the books that I've been reading. The plot seems to make more sense. I don't know. So, I already said this, but this is the third book in the series. It came out in 1930, so quite a long time ago. Now, some of the characters that we see in the Bungalow Mystery are similar to the revised text. We still have Helen Corning. I feel like she was in this book a little bit more. I'm not really positive on that. She may have been in the book about the same amount as the revised text. We still have Laura Pendleton, and we have Jacob Aborn and Stumpy Dowd, except Stumpy Dowd doesn't have a wife. Alma Dowd is completely non-existent in this version. Oh yeah, and there's no Don Cameron, the guy that Nancy, makes Laura Pendleton go to this barbecue with because she doesn't want to go on a date with him. He's non-existent in this version as well, and it's kind of something that I theorized on another episode. I think that Harriet just added all these random love interests for Nancy in the revisions. I don't really know why. Maybe just to make Nancy seem more desirable and she gets dates right and left, but I don't know. It is the tropiest of Nancy Drew tropes. Nancy Drew always has a date, and if she doesn't have a date, she could have had a date, she just didn't want one. She was too busy solving mysteries. So now really quickly, I'll read a brief synopsis to get us back in the feel for what the Bungalow Mystery is actually about. Nancy and Helen are in a horrible accident on Moon Lake and almost drown when Laura Pendleton saves them and they become friends. Laura tells them she recently lost her parents and is getting a guardian, but he is horrible. Laura runs away and asks Nancy for help. So basically that about sums this book up. There's also an inheritance involved because there's always an inheritance involved when these younger wards lose their parents and they have horrible foster parents, but we'll get to that. So let's go ahead and jump into some of the direct quotes and notes that I took down for the original text of the Bungalow Mystery. So this mystery starts off very similar to the revised text, and Nancy and Helen are in a boat and they're out on Moon Lake when a storm rolls in suddenly and they have to fight for their lives. Their boat takes on a lot of water, they get thrown into the water, and Helen is apparently not a great swimmer. Points deducted, Helen Corning. You're a gossip and you can't swim very well. But I don't know if in the revised text they come out and say that Helen's not a great swimmer. They just kind of imply this is a really bad storm. This would be hard for a champion Olympic swimmer to survive these kind of conditions. Now, I know that one of my biggest gripes with the revised text for this book was Nancy describes Laura Pendleton as being a strange girl, And I remember being like, Nancy, excuse me, this girl just saved your life. How about a little bit of gratitude? But we get a little bit more insight into why maybe Nancy's calling Laura Pendleton strange. I mean, it says in the book that Laura is wearing a lot of black. She is obviously grieving for her parents because they both just passed away. And so that kind of gives me a little more insight into why maybe she looked strange. I mean, if I was out on a lake and I was presumably like about to drown and I'm out there with my friend trying to save her life and my own, I would probably see somebody wearing like full black, it's like a high neck dress is what it kind of seems to be described as. It's just, that would be kind of creepy, I guess. So maybe that's why Nancy said she looked strange. Still though, I don't think that would be like an all-consuming thought when my head's about to go under the waves. Like, it's so funny to me and so Nancy that it's like you would really like call out somebody on their fashion choices when you're about to drown. Okay, you do you, boo. I'm feeling sassy today. I'm just gonna forewarn you guys, like, it's a brand new year, new me. I also just drank a lot of coffee too, so. But here's the big kicker for me. So Nancy is calling Laura strange. Laura went out on the water in a boat, and she apparently doesn't even know how to swim. That is incredibly brave. So it's after this, Nancy, Helen, and Laura have obviously bonded over this moment, and they get to meet Laura's new guardian, Jacob Aborn. And he is a horrible person. He's rough and he's rude to Laura, and he says they're going to his bungalow on Melrose Lake, which is kind of out of the way and not close to River Heights. I never really thought about this, like fully thought it through when I read the revised text, but it would be so hard to be in Laura Pendleton's shoes in that moment. I mean, her parents just passed away, and now this new guardian is a horrible person, and he's going to go take her off to somewhere far away from any other types of friends or acquaintances, and that would have to feel so isolating. So they all part ways, and the next note that I wrote down, I just thought this was funny, but Nancy teaches Helen how to swim at Moon Lake. And I mean, it's actually kind of sweet of her to help her friend out, because that would be hard to not know how to swim and then be in a situation like that. So I think Nancy's just trying to prepare Helen in case that happens again and they get in a situation where they almost drowned, which honestly, I'm sure that the statistics for that, for being Nancy's friend and the likelihood of almost drowning, is probably pretty high, because Nancy has boating accidents like every Tuesday. So later on, Nancy is driving back to River Heights, but there's a detour making her go towards Melrose Lake, which is where Laura Pendleton just coincidentally happens to be. And she gets caught in a storm, and then a tree almost falls on her car and blocks the road. Scary stuff. But who happens to show up but Laura Pendleton herself? She has a knack for showing up in these situations when Nancy needs her help. And she comes along and saves the day again, and she and Nancy get the tree out of the way and out of the road. And it's when they do this that Laura tells Nancy she hates her guardian and she's running away. So that didn't last incredibly long, but this next part made me laugh a little bit too hard. But Laura tells Nancy that Jacob Aborn doesn't even have a servant. Gasp! The horror. I feel like horror is one of the harder things to say in my accent. Like, I feel like it's like Worcestershire sauce. The horror. The horror. So anyways, we have to talk about this. The classism in these books, it blows me away continually how Nancy and some of her friends, I mean, they all have housemaids and housekeepers and, carmen, people who just do all these things for them. Carmen. I think the word that I was looking for there is chauffeur. But anyways, while asking Laura to do all the housework isn't cool, it's just silly to me, like how all of the people in these books, pretty much, they're either just super, super rich or super, super poor. There's no middle class. There's no, I don't know. It's just strange to me. And I kind of thought that this was a funny complaint coming from Laura, because, I mean, like, him being abusive, like, okay, that we need to talk about. But he is rough with Laura, and Laura also says that Jacob Aborn took her fur coat to the pawn shop and tried to take her mother's jewels and locked her in a room. Like, that stuff, that seems more on the grounds for, like, a complaint. You know what I mean? Now, if he's making you scrub floors at 2 a.m, then yeah, but it seemed very funny. Like, he doesn't even have a servant. So Nancy takes Laura to her home in River Heights, and then she starts to investigate, and she sees Jacob Aborn sneaking into the woods away from the bungalow. And Laura kind of mentions this in passing, and she says, yeah, he goes out at all weird hours of the night, and he has a bundle of food, and then when he comes back, the bundle's empty. So it's very suspicious. So Nancy loses sight of Jacob Aborn in the woods, but she does find another bungalow, which is very run down and shoddy looking. And so she goes to look in and stands up on a box. And this is what we see in the original cover art, which is really, really cool. But Jacob Aborn comes up behind Nancy and confronts her. And Nancy tells him Laura is not coming back to him. Naturally, this kind of makes him upset. So the next thing Nancy ends up doing is she books a hotel room nearby, I guess in Melrose, somewhere close by, and she sneaks into the bungalow where Aborn and Laura were staying, and she ends up having to hide in the closet because he comes back suddenly. I always love these scenes where Nancy has to hide and the person isn't aware that she's there with them. Like, I don't know if you guys have ever had this happen. I once, hated to go to choir so much at this church that I went to when I was a kid. Like, I liked church. I just didn't like singing in front of people. And I didn't like that the teacher would call me out all the time. He would be like, put your program down. Like, we can't see your mouth. And I was like, no, that's the point. I want to hold this in front of my face. And so I actually hid in the room where all the choir robes were. I went behind the choir robes and I would hide in there and nobody would know that I was in there. But I was always so afraid somebody's going to find me and they're going to be like, what are you doing? I don't know. What are you doing? I don't want to be a soprano anymore. How about that? So Nancy is basically doing the same thing. She's hiding behind some dresses in Laura Pendleton's closet, and Jacob Aborn actually starts to move some of the clothes, and it's so suspenseful. You think Nancy's going to be found, but then he gets distracted by something and goes back downstairs. So then Nancy sneaks downstairs and she ends up watching Jacob Aborn from the pantry and then from behind a couch, almost getting caught a few times. But it's then that we realize that this is not Jacob Aborn, this is Stumpy Dowd. He refers to himself, I think he talks to himself in third person. He's like, old Stumpy Dowd or something, which, if you're going to be a villain, you probably shouldn't speak to yourself out loud. So Nancy is able to sneak out and she goes back to the original bungalow to investigate it, the one that's kind of falling apart, and she finds the real Jacob Aborn. And this scene was really scary because Nancy feels like she's being watched, and she looks down the steps into this basically dungeon where Stumpy Dowd is keeping the real Jacob Aborn. And they look so similar, she does a double take. She thinks that it's Stumpy Dowd, or she thinks that it's, yeah, I'm even confusing myself. So sure enough, Stumpy Dowd shows up and ties Nancy up, and he leaves Nancy and the real Jacob Aborn in the bungalow cellar, and he leaves the key to Jacob's shackles to taunt them. He hangs it up on the steps just out of both of their reach because neither of them can get to it. And Stumpy says they can look at it while they rot. Wow. Horrible person he is. So eventually Nancy is able to free herself, and she and Jacob Aborn make it back to the house, but he is incredibly weak because he's been down there for I don't even know how long. I don't know if it's been a couple weeks or it's long enough that he is very weak. And so Nancy leaves him at the bungalow, the nicer one, and drives to the nearest hotel, calls the police about Stumpy Dowd, and sends for a doctor. Man, things are so much easier now that we have cell phones. So the next thing that I wrote down is Nancy pursues Stumpy and meets her dad and Laura on the road in Carson's brown sedan. And I think they were looking for her because she's been missing a little bit. She was supposed to be home for dinner or something. But they eventually catch up to Stumpy, and it's like Grand Theft Auto. Carson is chasing Stumpy Dowd, and everyone is speeding like nobody's going the speed limit. And Carson shoots at Stumpy's car before he rolls over a cliff. And then we break this super suspenseful and action-packed scene with this random note that I wrote down. I put, they spell Boulder weird in this book. They spell it Bowlder. Boulder? I don't know. I've never seen it spelled like that before. I've always seen it Boulder. But anyway, Nancy drags the suitcases of money out of the car because it's on fire and it may explode soon. And they drag Stumpy out before this car just goes up in flames. Oh yeah, and the suitcases, that money is basically Laura's inheritance because Stumpy Dowd was gonna just make for the border or go somewhere. I don't know, he was gonna take off and live it up on her inheritance. But they end up taking Stumpy to the hospital, and I assume he has 2nd or 3rd degree burns. He's probably pretty injured too, like probably has some broken bones from going over that cliff in the car. But according to Carson, he guesses that Stumpy will get 25 to 30 years. Which, that's pretty optimistic. Maybe the justice system was tougher back in the day. I don't know. But we do get a kind of cool detail, because earlier in the book, it says that Laura Pendleton wears a lot of black, a lot of darker colors. But by the end of the book, she's wearing more bright colors, more colorful clothes. So she started the book by grieving, and now she has a guardian who truly cares about her. She has this inheritance. I just like that they added that detail. It's just good writing. Now, of course, Nancy doesn't want to take any kind of compensation or money for solving this mystery, but she does get a necklace from Laura Pendleton, and I believe it's one of her mother's pieces. And Nancy, of course, is like, no, that's important to you. Having lost her own mother, she knows, it's, don't want to give that stuff away. But Laura is like, no, it's okay. I have other jewels of hers and I want you to have this. Now for the What's Cooking with Hannah Gruen segment of this podcast, there were a few mentionings of food. There was a section where they talked about tea and cake. And then apparently at some point they had beef broth and then they had waffles. Together, those things sound really gross. So now let's talk about the things I liked and the things I didn't like about the original text for the Bungalow Mystery. So this was an intense book. We had shootouts, we had car chases, we had Nancy hiding in several places and almost getting caught. There were several times when I found myself holding my breath, and I love when a book is able to do that. So I couldn't really think of anything that I didn't like with this book. With the revised book, there were a lot of things that I ended up not liking, but this was a pretty solid book. Now let's compare the rating that I gave the revised text and the rating I gave the original text. So the revised text, I actually gave a 1. The original text, I ended up giving a 3.5 to 4 magnifying glasses. It was a pretty decent book. So yeah, I have to say that I like the original text for this book better. It's still not one of my favorite mysteries in the entire Nancy Drew series. It just doesn't stand out to me in a lot of ways. But it's still a good book. So that concludes today's episode where we discuss the original text of the Bungalow Mystery. Now, for next week's episode, we're going to break it up a little bit and we're going to talk about the 4th Nancy Drew computer game, Treasure in the Royal Tower. I also wanted to give you all a heads up. I'm getting ready to change up a few things on the podcast. So the original text, I'm going to continue to cover them from the Mystery at Lilac Inn all the way up to the Hidden Window Mystery. But I'm going to continue to do those on my subscription-based podcast, which is True Drew Files. I always do a lot of fun bonus content over there. We talk about books, we talk about the games, just a lot of more in-depth things when it comes to Nancy Drew's universe. So if you guys want to check that out, there's a lot of cool, fun stuff over there. And on the rest of the regular episodes for True Drew podcast, I am getting ready to discuss some movies and some TV shows. I'm really excited to kind of break up since we finished reading the original 56 books. I thought it would be fun to start discussing different Nancy Drew media. So stay tuned for next week's episode. At the end of that episode, I will be announcing what Nancy Drew movies and TV shows we're going to be tackling next. Until next time, thank you for listening to this episode of True Drew Podcast. Can't get enough of the podcast? Then check out my subscription series, True Drew Files, available on Apple and Spotify. For Nancy Drew books and merchandise, you can check out my website, www.truedrewpodcast.com. For business inquiries, you can contact me at truedrewpodcast@gmail.com, or you can connect with me on Instagram at True Drew Podcast.